Hi, I'm Joy McDonnell. Welcome to our Simplicity YouTube channel. Today, I'm going to show you how to add a button-out lining to a jacket. This particular jacket is perfect for the fall right into the winter because it has that button-out piece to it. So let me show you what it looks like on the inside. The button-out is right in here. It's a nice quilted fabric. So in the fall, when it's still just a little bit cool, you can wear this without the lining. And then right into the winter when it gets really cold, add the lining and you'll be nice and warm on those cold days. For this project, we're using pattern number 1015 from Simplicity. In this lining, you're going to be using two different fabrics. The body of the lining is made from a quilted fabric, and then the sleeve is made from a satin finish lining that has a flannel back. So when you put your arm into the sleeve, it's nice and soft and good and warm. Once you have your fabric selected and your pattern purchased, you'll need to pick out the right pieces for your actual construction of the lining. For this, we're going to use piece number 20. This is the front lining pieces, and you'll cut two. And then for the back, you're going to cut piece number 21. This piece is cut on the fold so that you have one solid piece. For your sleeve, you're going to use piece number 19, and you'll cut two pieces from your sleeve fabric. I have the back piece all laid out. This is pattern piece number 21, and I've gone ahead and cut my notches, and I've already traced my dart piece onto my fabric. So with that marked, I've already got one of the darts already sewed in the back. And the first thing I want to do is start by pinning these darts. I've got my bottom edge right here. When I'm sewing, I'm going to be sewing from the center out to those points at the end. And I want to make sure that I'm lining up the center point of this dart. So I'm just going to pin from one side to the other. So I know I've got that. Fold it in half, and that will match right up. I can pin that. And then I want to mark the top piece of that dart. To start sewing this dart, I'm going to sew from the middle point down to the bottom first. So I'm putting my center point in here, take out the pin. I don't want to sew over my pins. And then I'm going to sew right down to this bottom dart. And when I'm doing that, I want to sew right off the edge. I don't need to do any back tacking or anything. If I want to, I can get my needle down into the down position. And I'm following with my presser foot along the marks that I've made when I did my tracing the dots. So I'm just going to sew right off that edge, raise the needle, and go ahead and pull that piece out. And then we'll do the same thing, except this time I'm going to sew from that center out to the top of that dart. I'm going to go ahead and let myself sew right off that edge. If you haven't sewn darts before, you might want to practice a little bit so that you practice going right off the edge of your fabric. Now that those darts are sewn, the next thing I want to do is iron those darts to the center of my piece. Before we press this dart to the center, we want to press it flat. So I have my seam right here, and I'm just going to press with my iron. This is different than ironing. I don't want to take the iron and run it back and forth. I want to actually press that into place. And then I'm going to open that out and then press that dart towards the center. So the dart itself has a little bit of length to it. So when it says to press a dart towards the center or towards a certain side, you're actually folding that dart and pressing it into place so that it sits where you want it to sit. My next step is sewing our shoulder seams together. And I know this because I'm following along with the guide sheet that comes with my pattern. All my steps are in here, and I've already made my jacket. So the next step is to sew up those shoulder seams. And I'm taking the two lining pieces that I have for the front. The straight edge goes along the edge that I have. That's going to make up the seam on the side. So I'm going to flip to make sure that my right sides are together. And I've got the curved edge in the center of my jacket. And then I'm simply going to match up those shoulder seams. And I'm looking for the notches that I cut earlier when I cut out my pattern. And I'm going to go ahead and pin these together so that as I get to my sewing machine, everything's in the right place. I'm going to begin by sewing my shoulder seam, and following my instructions it tells me a 5/8 inch seam allowance. So I'm using the ruler on my sewing machine for my 5/8 inch seam allowance. And I want to back tack just a little bit to make sure the stitch stays in place. And then do the same thing on the other end. And then I'll do the same for the other shoulder seam. And now that I have those seams all sewn up, I'll want to go back to my ironing board and press the seams flat to make sure that the thread and the fabric are all joined together, and then I'll open the seam and press the seam open. The next step is to put the sleeve into the lining. Now you've already done this with the jacket. We're going to do it the same exact way for the lining. The first thing we want to do is make sure that the right sides are facing each other. And you can double check that by looking for your double notches. The double notches on the sleeve piece are going to match up with the double notches on the actual body piece. So I like to start there and go ahead and pin that piece and then move right to the front, because on the front piece I have a single notch, and the single notch will match with the single notch here on my front. So I want to make sure that I'm using those, and also make sure that while I'm cutting my pattern, I'm actually cutting and marking these pieces. You don't have to cut the actual V in, you can just make a single cut, and if you want it to go a little bit faster, that helps you go a little bit faster. So now we're going to go ahead and pin the edges in, and I'm going to do this on both sides first, and then I'm going to come to the top of the sleeve. So I'm just matching right up to that center seam, and then I'm going to look for the notch that's at the top of the sleeve and the seam that we just created at that shoulder seam, and go ahead and pin that together. Then there are two small dots that are on either side of this particular seam, and I've got those marked on each piece, so I want to look for that and then fit that sleeve into the remainder of the way. So we'll go ahead and pin that all the way down. And I'll do the same thing for the other side, looking for that small dot. Taking the time to pin is important here, because then you know everything's going to fit. And I've already got my other sleeve pinned in place as well. So next we'll go right to the machine and we'll sew these sleeves in place. Now that we're at the sewing machine, we're going to use that same 5/8 inch seam allowance and sew right along that sleeve edge. And I'm using the sleeve edge as a guide for my stitch, and I want to make sure that I'm back tacking at the start and the finish of the seam. As you're working through this, there are some curves in here, so sometimes it's helpful to give yourself a moment to rearrange, and you might need to lift up your presser foot, leave the needle in the down position, and readjust your fabric. So once I have this sleeve set in, I want to go ahead and do the same thing for the second sleeve. Once you have both your sleeves set in, you want to come back between those notches on the front and the back and sew about 1/8 of an inch away from your first seam, and then we're going to clip and cut away that extra fabric. So now that we've sewn that second seam right along the first seam, we're going to go ahead and clip away some of that excess fabric that would be under the underarm so that it's comfortable to wear the lining under the jacket. I'm going from the edge right up to where that notch is and just trimming right next to that seam. to take away that bulk. And we're going to do that on each side of the sleeve that we have here. I'm going to do one side and then come right over here to the other side and go ahead and clip. Once I have this cut, I'm going to go to the ironing board and I want to press this seam flat. I want to just go ahead and press it so that those threads are set, and then I'm going to open up the seam and press towards the sleeve. So once I have all of that pressed, the next step is to start to pin that side seam, and I'm just going to go ahead and start that here and pin the side seam all the way right up, right to that sleeve. Now yours would be pressed, but I'm going to go ahead and pin this one. And you can see that right from the bottom edge of the lining all the way to the sleeve is one entire stitch. And I'm paying attention to those notches because I want to make sure that the notches are matching up. And then once you have it pinned, you're going to sew all the way from one whole seam. So it's going to go from the bottom of the sleeve all the way to that underarm seam and then right down to the bottom of the lining. So let's go to the sewing machine and get that done. As we get ready to stitch this seam, you want to go from your garment edge to your sleeve edge, kind of from your widest part on your seam to your narrowest part. So we're going to start right here at the lining bottom, and I'm going to back tack so that I know that my seam stays in place. And then come right all the way up that edge. And I'm using the 5/8 inch marking as my seam allowance. And as I prepare to come up to the area where the sleeve and the garment connect to each other, I want to kind of give myself a little bit of a pivot point, so I'm going to drop the needle down in that section. Because my fabrics are changing, I'm just going to give myself a little double check there, and then go ahead and finish up that seam. And as I approach the end, I want to add my back tack, and then do the same thing for the other side. The next step, once you have your side seams pressed and ready to go, you've been pressing the whole way through, that's really important as you're going along, we're going to finish off this raw edge right here, and we're going to do that with a prepackaged bias tape. I just want to show you how nicely that finishes off that edge and how easy it is to put bias tape in place. But I'm going to show you on a little scrap because it's a little easier to see than on the whole big piece that we have here. When you're looking to purchase your bias tape, you're going to see a couple of things, and these are important things to note. The first thing is the size of the tape. So here we're using a 1/4 inch bias tape. The second thing to look for is it a single fold or a double fold, because that makes a difference. This particular one is a double fold, and what that means is that the bias tape actually has 2 folds on either side, so that we get a nice finished edge on either side of the bias tape, and then that is folded one more time to make the 1/4 inch. And all of that work is already done for you when you're purchasing the tape. The first thing you want to do is take the tape out of the packaging and just press out any of the creases that might be there. They always end up being there. Just go ahead and press those right out. The next thing I want to point out is when you're working with bias tape, when you get this out and you start exploring with it, look at the fold, because you'll notice that one side is a little tiny hair of a bit shorter than the other side, and that will help you in your sewing. So when you're sewing and you're stitching this down, you're going to stitch with that narrower side on the front so that you're able to see that, because you're going to stitch right along that edge, and what that's going to allow you to do is catch that other edge that's a little bit longer and a little bit wider, so that you only have to apply your bias tape in one pass. You don't have to sew it on twice. So the prepackaged bias tape is a real helpful piece. Now I'm going to show you how to put your fabric into this. I'm going to double check that I have the narrow side on the top. That's going to be on the right side of my fabric. and I'm going to open out that bias tape. The fabric, when I put it in, you want to always leave a little extra edge. If you're doing an overlap or you're just getting started, I like to have a little extra bias tape on that edge. And I'm putting the fabric right up against that crease. And then that's going to fold over and finish off that raw edge that I have. Now, there are a couple of things that you can do here. If you've worked with bias tape for a long time, you're going to put the needle in the down position and kind of work with getting it around your piece as you're at the sewing machine. But if it's your first time and you're a little bit nervous, you might want to go ahead and pin your bias tape in place. I'm going to put the pins in along that bias tape, and then as I'm sewing, I'll take those pins out to go along. If you do this, sometimes as you're going along, the bias tape, because it's cut on the bias, it might stretch a little bit more than your fabric, so allow yourself a chance to rearrange your pins if you have to. So go ahead and pin this into position, and you can see right there how nicely this kind of finishes off that raw edge. Now, if you also want to make sure that you don't have to readjust your pins or readjust anything, you could come back and hand stitch a little basting stitch along those edges so that you know this is going to stay right where you put it. So let's go back to our finished piece here, and I'm going to show you how to sew down the bias tape and then how to lap the two edges so that you have a nice finished edge as the beginning and the end come together. So as I come up to the place where I started, I've got the pieces of bias tape connecting. So on the end of the one that I'm sewing on, the edge that I'm sewing on, I want to just give myself a little fold, and then I'm going to overlap those two right on each other. Now that you've got your bias tape on all of your edges of your lining, on the garment piece, the next thing you want to do is the same technique for applying bias tape, but this time you're going to apply it to your sleeves. So both of your sleeves will have your bias tape so that those are finished edges as well. And then using the small dots, you're going to place all the buttons so that you have your button out lining. I have one button left to put in place. Just put it over my small dot marking, and with a needle and thread, sew the button in place. The last step you want to do on your lining is your thread loop. And this is what's going to hold your sleeve down. You're going to have a button on your sleeve on your jacket, and this loop will connect right to that button so that your sleeve doesn't come in and out when you take the jacket on and off. So you make that, and I want to show you what it looks like on the jacket where the buttonholes line up. The buttons correspond with the buttonholes right here on the jacket, so that your button out lining fits right into your jacket nice and snug. All of the steps we just followed are in the guide sheet included with the pattern pieces in Simplicity Pattern number 1015. Click on the links below to find the supplies you need, and subscribe to the Simplicity YouTube channel for more sewing ideas, tips, and techniques. Let me know what you think of this project in the comment section below. Also, let me know what other videos you would like to see from Simplicity Patterns. I'm Joy, and I appreciate you watching. Happy sewing!